In the ancient world, few crimes provoked more fury, more fear, and more brutal punishment than adultery. Across every civilization, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the temples of Rome, from the courts of China to the pyramids of Egypt, one transgression stood above almost all others in its capacity to destroy lives, families, and entire bloodlines. But this wasn't about love. It wasn't even really about sex. Adultery, in the ancient world, was a crime against property, against legitimacy, against the very foundations of social order. And the punishments? The punishments were designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to terrorize, and to serve as a warning that would echo through generations. Today we're going to explore the most shocking punishments for adultery in ancient times. From drowning to burning, from mutilation to social death, from bizarre sexual humiliations to public executions, we'll examine 8 major civilizations and discover how they dealt with what they considered the ultimate betrayal. But before we descend into this dark chapter of human history, if you're fascinated by the brutal realities of ancient civilizations, make sure you're subscribed to Dark Chronicles. We explore history's darkest secrets every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, gave us the first cities, the first writing systems, and the first codified laws. And among those laws, written in cuneiform on stone tablets around 1754 BCE, was the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest and most comprehensive legal codes in human history. The Code of Hammurabi was brutal in its simplicity. Law 129 stated clearly, "If a man's wife be caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and throw them into the water." Drowning. Both the woman and her lover, bound together in death as they were supposedly bound in sin, thrown into the Euphrates River to die. There was no trial by jury, no appeal, no mercy. If you were caught in the act, your fate was sealed. But here's what makes this particularly chilling. The husband had the power to pardon his wife. If he chose to forgive her, the king could then pardon her lover. But if the husband demanded justice, both died. The woman's life literally hung on her husband's mercy, or his rage. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about property. In Mesopotamian society, a wife was her husband's property, and adultery was theft. Theft of his exclusive sexual access, theft of certainty about his children's paternity, theft of his honor. The punishment had to be public, brutal, and absolute. The drowning served multiple purposes. It was a religious purification, water washing away sin, a public spectacle, deterring others, and a permanent solution, no possibility of the affair continuing. The bound bodies would float downstream as a warning to anyone who saw them. Mesopotamia set the template. But as we'll see, other civilizations would find even more creative ways to punish adultery. In ancient Egypt, adultery wasn't just a crime against a husband, it was a crime against the gods themselves. The Egyptians, who revered Ma'at, the concept of cosmic order and justice, saw adultery as a fundamental disruption of divine harmony. The teaching of Ptah-hotep, one of the oldest surviving pieces of Egyptian wisdom literature, warned men explicitly, "Do not be fascinated by women. Be careful when approaching women, for 1,000 men have perished because of them." When adultery was committed by a married woman, the punishment was death. But here's where the gender inequality becomes starkly apparent. While the woman faced execution, the male accomplice received 1,000 blows of the lash. This extreme double standard existed across almost every ancient civilization we'll explore today. If you're shocked by this inequality, wait until you hear about ancient Greece. But first, hit that like button if you're finding this investigation as disturbing as I am. The Egyptians believed that the offense fell primarily on the woman. Why? Because she was seen as the guardian of family purity. Her body was the vessel for legitimate heirs, and any violation of that exclusivity threatened the entire social order. The husband had legal rights in these cases. He could choose to punish his wife himself, forgive her, or bring the case to court. But if he accused her without proof, the court would decide. This gave women a small measure of protection against false accusations, though in practice the burden of proof was heavily stacked against them. What's particularly interesting about Egyptian adultery law is its religious dimension. Adultery was seen as making it easier to commit other sins. As one ancient text put it, "It is easier to commit any other sin after adultery." Once you've violated the sacred bond of marriage, all other moral boundaries become meaningless. The punishment wasn't just about justice. It was about restoring cosmic order, appeasing the gods, and preventing the spread of moral corruption through society. Ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, had some of the most bizarre and humiliating punishments for adultery in the ancient world. And here's where things get truly shocking. In Athens, the law was clear. All women under guardianship, daughters, wives, even widows, were forbidden territory. If a man was caught in the act with another man's property, the guardian, usually the father, brother, or husband, was legally allowed to kill the intruder on the spot. But there was an alternative to death. And this is where Greek punishment gets creative and disturbing. The punishment was called radishment. The male adulterer would be forcibly sodomized with a radish. Yes, you heard that correctly. A radish. But this wasn't random cruelty. It was calculated humiliation with a specific purpose: feminization. In Greek society, there were two roles in sexual activity: the penetrator and the penetrated. The penetrator was masculine, dominant, powerful. The penetrated was feminine, submissive, powerless. By forcing the adulterer into the woman's role, the punishment destroyed his social status as a man. He had violated another man's woman, so he would be made into a woman himself, publicly, painfully, and permanently in terms of his reputation. There was another option: depilation. The removal of all pubic hair using ash. Again, this was feminization. Women were expected to remove body hair, men were not. To be forcibly depilated was to be stripped of masculine identity. And if you think that's shocking, wait until you hear what the Romans did with a fish. But before we get to that, drop a comment below. Which civilization do you think had the most brutal punishment? We've covered 3 so far, and we have 5 more to go. But the punishment didn't end with physical humiliation. For women caught in adultery, the consequences were social death. The husband was legally obligated to divorce his wife. If he didn't, he would lose his civilian rights. The state enforced this because a man who tolerated adultery was seen as weak, corrupted, and dangerous to social order. The adulterous woman was forbidden from wearing jewelry, participating in public ceremonies, and most devastatingly, from remarrying. She became a social outcast, unable to participate in the religious and civic life that defined Greek identity. Why was adultery treated more seriously than rape? Because rape was seen as a one-time violation, but adultery implied an ongoing relationship. The lover had won the woman's affection, gained access to the household, and potentially fathered children who might inherit as if they were legitimate. Adultery threatened the entire system of property and inheritance that held Greek society together. There was one exception to all these rules: Sparta. In Sparta, female adultery wasn't a major concern. Why? Because Spartan men were married to the state first, their wives second. They lived in military barracks, saw their wives infrequently, and the society valued producing strong warriors over maintaining strict sexual exclusivity. Spartan women even engaged in wife-sharing for eugenic purposes. If a woman could produce a strong child with a different Spartan citizen, that was acceptable. What mattered was the strength of the child, not the identity of the father. But Sparta was the exception. For the rest of Greece, adultery was a crime that could destroy lives, reputations, and entire families. Rome, the Eternal City, took Greek ideas about adultery punishment and made them even more sadistic. Remember the radish from Greece? Rome had something worse: the sea mullet. The sea mullet is a fish equipped with 4 rigid spines. And yes, it was used exactly as you're imagining. The Roman poet Juvenal wrote, "And sometimes the husband's wrath exacts greater penalties than any law allows. One lover is slain by the sword, another bleeds under the lash. Some undergo the punishment of the mullet." The fish's spines made this punishment far more painful and dangerous than the Greek radish. It could cause serious internal injuries, infections, and lasting trauma. And like the Greek version, it was designed to feminize and humiliate the male adulterer, destroying his social standing forever. But Rome's approach to adultery changed dramatically under Emperor Augustus, who reigned from 27 BCE to 14 CE. Augustus was obsessed with moral reform. He believed that Rome's military and political success required moral discipline at home. So he passed the Lex Julia de Adulteris, the Julian law on adultery, which made infidelity a public crime for the first time in Roman history. But here's the catch: it only applied to women. Under Augustus's law, if a woman was found guilty of adultery, she would lose half her dowry, her lover would be fined a portion of his property, and both would be exiled to different locations, ensuring they could never reunite. The husband was obligated to divorce his wife. If he didn't, he could be charged with pimping, essentially profiting from his wife's sexual activity. The state was forcing men to defend their honor, whether they wanted to or not. The Roman jurist Ulpian criticized this double standard, writing, "It is very unjust for a husband to require from a wife a level of morality that he does not himself achieve." Even in ancient times, some people recognized the hypocrisy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into ancient injustice, make sure you're subscribed. We have more shocking historical investigations coming soon. Augustus wasn't kind even to his own blood. He exiled his daughter Julia and his granddaughter, also named Julia, for illicit relations. The emperor, who demanded moral purity from all Romans, couldn't control his own family, a fact that his political enemies never let him forget. Some patrician women found a loophole. They registered as prostitutes. Since prostitutes weren't subject to adultery laws, wealthy women could technically engage in affairs without legal consequences. But there was a catch: they would lose all inheritance rights and be excluded from respectable society. This loophole lasted until Emperor Tiberius, Augustus's successor, closed it by decreeing that no woman whose husband, father, or grandfather was a Roman knight or senator could register as a prostitute. Rome's approach to adultery reveals the fundamental tension in Roman society: the conflict between personal freedom and state control, between private morality and public order, between the rights of individuals and the demands of empire. In ancient China, women who had premarital sex or committed adultery faced some of the most extreme punishments in the ancient world: drowning and burial alive. The famous Song dynasty scholar Zhu Xi, who lived from 1130 to 1200 CE, declared that being chaste was more important to a woman than food. This philosophy shaped Chinese attitudes toward female sexuality for centuries, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties. Women were required to remain virgins until marriage. Any deviation from this standard brought disgrace not just to the woman, but to her entire family. And the punishment for adultery was designed to be so terrifying that no woman would dare risk it. Burial alive was particularly horrifying. The condemned woman would be placed in a wooden box or simply buried in the ground, left to suffocate slowly over hours or even days. Sometimes the burial was only partial. The woman would be buried up to her neck and left to die of exposure, thirst, and the elements. Drowning was the other common method. Like in Mesopotamia, the woman would be bound and thrown into a river or lake. But in China, this often happened without the male lover. The woman bore the full punishment alone. The gender inequality here is staggering. While women faced death, men often received lighter punishments or even went unpunished if the woman was unmarried. If this extreme injustice makes you angry, you're not alone. Share this video to spread awareness of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. The obsession with female chastity reached bizarre heights. In Tangyue village in Anhui province, stone archways were built to honor widows who remained celibate for decades after their husbands' deaths. One archway, built in 1787, honored a woman who remained chaste in widowhood for 60 years. According to historical records, this single village had 59 widows who remained celibate for more than 30 years, over an 880-year period. These women were celebrated, honored, and held up as examples of perfect virtue. But as one modern resident put it, "It's an honorable thing for the family, but painful for her." Such prejudiced ideas should be changed. The Tang Dynasty legal code, which governed from 618 to 907 CE, specified punishments for various sexual offenses. Illicit sexual intercourse was punished with 1.5 years of penal servitude. a relatively light sentence compared to the death penalties of other eras. But enforcement varied wildly depending on the dynasty, the region, and the social status of those involved. A wealthy family might be able to pay off officials or arrange a marriage to cover up an indiscretion. A poor family had no such options. Their daughter would face the full brutality of the law. Ancient India's approach to adultery punishment reveals one of the most complex and discriminatory legal systems in the ancient world. The caste-based hierarchy of the Manusmriti and Kautilya's Arthashastra. The Manusmriti, or Laws of Manu, divided adultery into 3 grades with corresponding fines. But the real brutality came when we look at how punishments varied based on caste. According to Kautilya's Arthashastra, written around 250 BCE, if a Kshatriya, a member of the warrior caste, committed adultery with an unguarded Brahmin woman, he would pay the highest fine. If a Vaishya, a merchant, did the same, he would be deprived of all his property. But if a Shudra, a member of the laborer caste, committed adultery with an unguarded Brahmin woman, he would be burned alive, wound round in mats. The punishment for adultery with the queen was even more extreme. The offender would be burned alive in a vessel, essentially boiled to death. For lower caste women, the punishment included mutilation. A Shudra or outcast woman caught in adultery would have her ears and nose cut off. This disfigurement marked her permanently, ensuring she could never hide her shame or reintegrate into society. We're seeing a pattern across all these civilizations: extreme gender inequality, brutal physical punishments, and social systems designed to control women's sexuality while giving men far more freedom. If you want to understand how these ancient attitudes still influence modern societies, check out my video on gender inequality in ancient civilizations. Link in the description. The Manusmriti stated that wives of all 4 castes are always the most deserving of protection. But this protection was really about protecting male property rights and ensuring legitimate heirs. Hindu philosophy viewed marriage as built on 3 pillars: rati, pleasure; dharma, duty; and praja, progeny. Sexual fidelity was central to this concept of marriage as a sacred partnership. Adultery didn't just violate the marriage, it violated cosmic order itself. The classic case of adultery in Hindu texts is that of Ahalya, who was seduced by the god Indra. Even though she was deceived, she bore the consequences, turned to stone, until she could be redeemed. The story reinforced the idea that women were responsible for maintaining sexual purity, even when they were victims of deception. Jewish law on adultery presents one of the most interesting evolutions in ancient legal thinking, from brutal capital punishment to a system so merciful that conviction became nearly impossible. Under biblical law, adultery was punishable by death. Deuteronomy 22:24 specified that if a betrothed woman committed adultery, both she and her lover would be stoned to death at the place of public execution. For a married woman, the Mishnah specified strangulation as the method of execution, a merciful form of death penalty because it was quicker than stoning. The rabbinical theory was that wherever the Bible mentioned the death penalty without specifying the method, strangulation was meant. The Talmudic rabbis created evidentiary standards so strict that conviction became virtually impossible. The accused had to be warned in advance, in the presence of 2 witnesses, not to commit adultery with the specific person. Then, those same 2 witnesses had to actually see the act of adultery taking place, and the accused had to acknowledge the warning before proceeding. As one scholar put it, the rabbis went so far as to declare that a woman could not be convicted of adultery unless it had been affirmatively shown that she knew the law relating to it, a theory that resulted in the practical impossibility of convicting any adulteress. In 40 CE, before the destruction of the Second Temple, the Jewish courts relinquished their right to inflict capital punishment, possibly under pressure from Roman authorities. After that, the adulterer was scourged, and the husband was compelled to divorce his wife, but no one was executed. The ordeal of bitter waters described in Numbers 5 was another unique feature of Jewish law. A woman suspected of adultery would be brought before a priest, who would make her drink water mixed with dust from the tabernacle floor while under oath. If she was guilty, the water would cause her to suffer. If innocent, she would be unharmed. But Rabbi Akiba added a crucial caveat. Only when the man is himself free from guilt will the waters be an effective test of his wife's guilt or innocence. But if he has been guilty of illicit intercourse, the waters will have no effect. This essentially nullified the ordeal, because what man could claim perfect sexual purity? The ordeal was eventually abolished entirely by Yohanan ben Zakkai, who cited Hosea 4:14. I will not punish your daughters when they commit whoredom, nor your spouses when they commit adultery, for themselves are separated with whores. Jewish law shows us that ancient societies could evolve toward mercy and justice. The rabbis recognized the hypocrisy of punishing women for adultery, while men engaged in the same behavior. This kind of moral progress in ancient times is rare and worth celebrating. If you're interested in more stories of progressive thinking in the ancient world, hit that subscribe button. Jesus' famous statement in John 8:7, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her," takes on new meaning in this context. He was echoing a principle that Jewish legal scholars had been developing for centuries, that moral judgment requires moral authority, and that authority requires personal purity. In the pre-Columbian Americas, the Aztec and Maya civilizations had their own brutal approaches to adultery, and some unique twists that set them apart from Old World societies. The Aztecs punished adultery with death for both parties. But here's what makes Aztec law unique. They also punished witnesses who failed to report adultery with death. That's right. If you knew about an affair and didn't report it to the authorities, you could be executed. Adultery was considered so dangerous to social order that concealing it was itself a capital crime. This created a society of surveillance where everyone was incentivized to report sexual transgressions. Privacy, as we understand it, didn't exist. Your neighbors, your family, even your servants could be compelled to testify against you, and they faced death if they didn't. Nobles faced even stricter standards. While commoners might receive some leniency for drunkenness or minor sexual indiscretions, nobles were expected to maintain perfect moral conduct. A noble caught in adultery would be executed, regardless of circumstances. The Maya also treated adultery as a serious crime. If a married woman committed adultery, she would be publicly shamed, paraded through the community as an example, and warning to others. Public shaming in Maya society was devastating. These were tight-knit communities where reputation was everything. To be publicly identified as an adulteress meant social death, exclusion from religious ceremonies, economic activities, and community life. What's interesting about both Aztec and Maya approaches is the emphasis on community enforcement and public punishment. Unlike many Old World societies where adultery was primarily a private matter between families, in Mesoamerica, it was a public crime that required public acknowledgement and public punishment. Now that we've explored 8 major ancient civilizations, let's step back and look at the patterns that emerge. First, extreme gender inequality was universal. In every single civilization we've examined, women faced harsher punishments than men. Women were executed, mutilated, exiled, or socially destroyed. Men paid fines, received corporal punishment, or in some cases faced no punishment at all. Second, adultery was rarely about morality in the way we understand it today. It was about property, legitimacy, and social order. A wife was her husband's property. Her sexual exclusivity ensured that his heirs were actually his biological children. Adultery threatened inheritance, property rights, and the entire social structure. Third, punishment served multiple functions: deterrence, retribution, purification, and social control. They weren't just about punishing the guilty, they were about sending a message to everyone else. Fourth, religious justifications were nearly universal. Whether it was Egyptian Ma'at, Hindu Dharma, Jewish covenant law, or Aztec cosmic order, adultery was framed as a violation of divine will, not just human law. These patterns reveal uncomfortable truths about human societies and how they've controlled sexuality, especially women's sexuality, throughout history. If this investigation has opened your eyes to the dark realities of ancient justice, make sure you're subscribed to Dark Chronicles. We're not done exploring history's darkest secrets, not by a long shot. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an upload. Fifth, There were exceptions and evolution. Sparta's permissive attitude, Jewish law's movement toward mercy, and the eventual abolition of many brutal punishments show that ancient societies could change, could question their assumptions, and could move toward more just systems. Finally, the psychological and social functions of these punishments went far beyond the immediate act. They reinforced gender hierarchies, maintained class distinctions, controlled women's bodies and sexuality, protected male honor and property, and ensured that everyone knew their place in the social order. So what do we learn from this dark journey through ancient punishments for adultery? First, that the past was brutal in ways we can barely imagine. The punishments we've explored today, drowning, burning, radishment, mullet torture, burial alive, mutilation, stoning, strangulation, these weren't aberrations. They were the norm. They were how civilized, sophisticated, culturally advanced societies dealt with sexual transgression. Second, that gender inequality has deep historical roots. The double standards we've seen weren't accidents or oversights. They were fundamental features of ancient legal systems, deliberately designed to control women's sexuality while giving men freedom. Third, that law and morality are not the same thing. These punishments were legal. They were enshrined in the most important legal codes of their time. But legal doesn't mean moral. Just because something is law doesn't make it right. Fourth, that societies can change. Jewish law evolved from stoning to mercy. Modern societies have largely decriminalized adultery. We've moved from public executions to private divorce proceedings. Progress is possible. But fifth, and perhaps most importantly, that the attitudes underlying these punishments haven't entirely disappeared. Around the world today, women still face violence, ostracism, and even death for sexual behavior that men engage in freely. The specific punishments may have changed, but the double standards persist. Understanding this history isn't just academic, it's essential for understanding how we got here, why certain attitudes persist, and what we need to change to create truly just societies. The ancient world was brutal, but we don't have to be. We can learn from history's darkest chapters without repeating them. We can acknowledge the injustices of the past while working toward a more just future. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey through ancient history. If you want more investigations into history's most shocking secrets, subscribe to Dark Chronicles. I'm your host, and I'll see you in the next video.